Chapter 32 of Nicholas Nickleby by Charles Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording by Anna Roberts. Nicholas Nickleby by Charles Dickens. Chapter 32. Relating chiefly to some remarkable conversation, and some remarkable proceedings to which it gives rise. "London at last!" cried Nicholas, throwing back his greatcoat, and rousing Smike from a long nap. "It seemed to me as though we should never reach it." "And yet you came along at a tidy pace too," observed the coachman, looking over his shoulder at Nicholas with no very pleasant expression of countenance. "Ay, I know that," was the reply, "but I have been very anxious to be at my journey's end, and that makes the way seem long." "Well," remarked the coachman, "if the way seemed long with such cattle as you've sat behind, you must have been most uncommon anxious." And so saying, he let out his whiplash, and touched up a little boy on the calves of his legs by way of emphasis. They rattled on through the noisy, bustling, crowded streets of London, now displaying long double rows of brightly burning lamps, dotted here and there with the chemist's glaring lights, and illuminated besides with the brilliant flood that streamed from the windows of the shops, where sparkling jewellery, silks, and velvets of the richest colours, the most inviting delicacies, and most sumptuous articles of luxurious ornament, succeeded each other in rich and glittering profusion. Streams of people apparently without end poured on, jostling each other in the crowd, and hurrying forward, scarcely seeming to notice the riches that surrounded them on every side, while vehicles of all shapes and makes, mingled up together in one moving mass, like running water, lent their ceaseless roar to swell the noise and tumult. As they dashed by the quickly changing and ever varying objects, it was curious to observe in what a strange procession they passed before the eye. Emporiums of splendid dresses, the materials brought from every quarter of the world, tempting stores of everything to stimulate and pamper the sated appetite, and give new relish to the oft-repeated feast, vessels of burnished gold and silver, wrought into every exquisite form of vase, and dish, and goblet, guns, swords, pistols, and patent engines of destruction, screws and irons for the crooked, clothes for the newly born, drugs for the sick, coffins for the dead, and churchyards for the buried, all these jumbled each with the other, and flocking side by side, seemed to flit by in motley dance like the fantastic groups of the old Dutch painter, and with the same stern moral for the unheeding restless crowd. Nor were there wanting objects in the crowd itself to give new point and purpose to the shifting scene. The rags of the squalid ballad singer fluttered in the rich light that showed the goldsmith's treasures, pale and pinched up faces hovered about the windows where was tempting food, hungry eyes wandered over the profusion guarded by one thin sheet of brittle glass, an iron wall to them. Half-naked shivering figures stopped to gaze at Chinese shawls and golden stuffs of India. There was a christening party at the largest coffin maker's, and a funeral hatchment had stopped some great improvements in the bravest mansion. Life and death went hand in hand, wealth and poverty stood side by side, repletion and starvation laid them down together. But it was London, and the old country lady inside, who had put her head out of the coach window a mile or so this side Kingston, and cried out to the driver that she was sure he must have passed it, and forgotten to set her down, was satisfied at last. Nicholas engaged beds for himself and Smike at the inn where the coach stopped, and repaired, without the delay of another moment, to the lodgings of Newman Noggs, for his anxiety and impatience had increased with every succeeding minute, and were almost beyond control. There was a fire in Newman's garret, and a candle had been left burning. The floor was cleanly swept, the room was as comfortably arranged as such a room could be, and meat and drink were placed in order upon the table. Everything bespoke the affectionate care and attention of Newman Noggs, but Newman himself was not there. "Do you know what time he will be home?" inquired Nicholas, tapping at the door of Newman's front neighbour. "Ah, Mr. Johnson," said Crowle, presenting himself. "Welcome, sir. How well you're looking. I never could have believed—" "Pardon me," interposed Nicholas. "My question I am extremely anxious to know." "Why, he has a troublesome affair of business," replied Crowle, "and he will not be home before 12 o'clock. He was very unwilling to go, I can tell you, but there was no help for it. However, he left word that you were to make yourself comfortable till he came back, and that I was to entertain you, which I shall be very glad to do." In proof of his extreme readiness to exert himself for the general entertainment, Mr. Crowle drew a chair to the table as he spoke, and helping himself plentifully to the cold meat, invited Nicholas and Smike to follow his example. Disappointed and uneasy, Nicholas could touch no food, so, after he had seen Smike comfortably established at the table, he walked out, despite a great many dissuasions uttered by Mr. Crowle with his mouth full, and left Smike to detain Newman in case he returned first. As Miss La Creevy had anticipated, Nicholas betook himself straight to her house. Finding her from home, he debated within himself for some time whether he should go to his mother's residence, and so compromise her with Ralph Nickleby. Fully persuaded, however, that Newman would not have solicited him to return unless there was some strong reason which required his presence at home, he resolved to go there, and hastened eastwards with all speed. Mrs. Nickleby would not be at home, the girl said, until past 12 or later. She believed Miss Nickleby was well, but she didn't live at home now, nor did she come home except very seldom. She couldn't say where she was stopping, but it was not at Madame Mantalini's. She was sure of that. With his heart beating violently, and apprehending he knew not what disaster, Nicholas returned to where he had left Smike. Newman had not been home. He wouldn't be till 12 o'clock. There was no chance of it. Was there no possibility of sending to fetch him, if it were only for an instant, or forwarding to him one line of writing to which he might return a verbal reply? That was quite impracticable. He was not at Golden Square, and probably had been sent to execute some commission at a distance. Nicholas tried to remain quietly where he was, but he felt so nervous and excited that he could not sit still. He seemed to be losing time unless he was moving. It was an absurd fancy, he knew, but he was wholly unable to resist it, so he took up his hat and rambled out again. He strolled westward this time, pacing the long streets with hurried footsteps, and agitated by 1,000 misgivings and apprehensions which he could not overcome. He passed into Hyde Park, now silent and deserted, and increased his rate of walking, as if in the hope of leaving his thoughts behind. They crowded upon him more thickly, however, now there were no passing objects to attract his attention, and the one idea was always uppermost, that some stroke of ill fortune must have occurred so calamitous in its nature that all were fearful of disclosing it to him. The old question arose again and again. What could it be? Nicholas walked till he was weary, but was not one bit the wiser, and indeed he came out of the park at last a great deal more confused and perplexed than when he went in. He had taken scarcely anything to eat or drink since early in the morning, and felt quite worn out and exhausted. As he returned languidly towards the point from which he had started, along one of the thoroughfares which lie between Park Lane and Bond Street, he passed a handsome hotel, before which he stopped mechanically. An expensive place, I dare say, thought Nicholas, but a pint of wine and a biscuit are so great debauch wherever they are had, and yet I don't know. He walked on a few steps, but looking wistfully down the long vista of gas lamps before him, and thinking how long it would take to reach the end of it, and being besides in that kind of mood in which a man is most disposed to yield to his first impulse, and being besides strongly attracted to the hotel, in part by curiosity, and in part by some odd mixture of feelings which he would have been troubled to define, Nicholas turned back again, and walked into the coffee room. It was very handsomely furnished. The walls were ornamented with the choicest specimens of French paper, enriched with a gilded cornice of elegant design. The floor was covered with a rich carpet, and 2 superb mirrors, one above the chimney-piece, and one at the opposite end of the room, reaching from floor to ceiling, multiplied the other beauties, and added new ones of their own to enhance the general effect. There was a rather noisy party of 4 gentlemen in a box by the fireplace, and only 2 other persons present, both elderly gentlemen, and both alone. Observing all this in the first comprehensive glance with which a stranger surveys a place that is new to him, Nicholas sat himself down in the box next to the noisy party, with his back towards them, and postponing his order for a pint of claret until such time as the waiter and one of the elderly gentlemen should have settled a disputed question relative to the price of an item in the bill of fare, took up a newspaper and began to read. He had not read 20 lines, and was in truth himself dozing, when he was startled by the mention of his sister's name. Little Kate Nickleby were the words that caught his ear. He raised his head in amazement, and as he did so, saw by the reflection in the opposite glass, that 2 of the party behind him had risen, and were standing before the fire. It must have come from one of them, thought Nicholas. He waited to hear more with a countenance of some indignation, for the tone of speech had been anything but respectful, and the appearance of the individual, whom he presumed to have been the speaker, was coarse and swaggering. This person, so Nicholas observed in the same glance at the mirror which had enabled him to see his face, was standing with his back to the fire conversing with a younger gentleman, who stood with his back to the company, wore his hat, and was adjusting his shirt collar by the aid of the glass. They spoke in whispers, now and then bursting into a loud laugh, but Nicholas could catch no repetition of the words, nor anything sounding at all like the words which had attracted his attention.